A reading from Devar Vayigash, Genesis 44:18 through 47:27. Then Joseph instructed his chamberlain as follows: "Fill these men's sacks with as much food as they can carry, and put each man's money in the mouth of his sack, and put my cup, the silver one, in the mouth of the youngest one's sack, as well as the money for his rations." He did as Joseph had instructed. At daybreak, the men were sent off with their donkeys. They had gone only a little way from the city when Joseph said to his chamberlain, "Away now and follow those men. When you catch up with them, say to them, 'Why have you repaid good with evil? Is this not what my Lord uses for drinking and also for reading omens? What you have done is wrong.'" Now be seated for my words. Davar Vayigash. Vayigash means he approached, because Judah approached Joseph after this incident of being caught stealing the cup. Now, we're going to have to put this story together by reaching back into a couple of the past Torah portions and working our way up to this Torah portion for the whole story, really, of what's going on in this week's portion to make sense. And since I wasn't here the last couple times anyway, it's all right for me to do that, right? So now there had been a famine in the land, and Joseph had arranged ahead of time, because of God's divine intervention with Pharaoh, to store up grain so that when the famine was going to happen, that Egypt would be the place where all the sustenance was, and everyone was going to have to come there to get their needs met. So Joseph's brothers go to Egypt to buy grain, and he meets with them, and they don't recognize him. And they go back a second time to get grain from him again and don't recognize him. And then they're sent back home, and then what we just read, they're brought back, they all come back, and they still don't recognize him. The third time they're in his presence, and they don't recognize who he is. And I want you to remember this recognize motif. Now in Genesis 42:8, we're told the first time he sees his brothers, after he's been in Egypt for all this time, Joseph recognized his brothers, but they did not recognize him. Okay. And he doesn't reveal himself to them. He knows who they are, and he chooses to keep his identity a secret. He doesn't reveal himself to them until this week's Parsha. And only after Vayigash. Only after Judah approaches. Only after Judah approaches does he reveal himself. So I think that's important. We're going to look at that. Why Judah and not Reuben? Now the reason that they're back there and in trouble is because someone stole this cup, right? But Joseph had stowed it away in their belongings, knowingly in the youngest son's bag, Benjamin. And when they come back, Benjamin is the one who's in trouble. Not all of them. Joseph says, "No, you all get to go free, only the guilty one. Only the one in whose bag the cup was found. Only he is kept." Well, as the oldest brother, as the firstborn, it's Reuben's responsibility to make sure everyone is taken care of. That's his job. But it's not Reuben who steps forward, it's Judah. And this is important. So let's go back and take a look a little more about the things that transpired to bring us to this point. Now, the parallels between Joseph and Yeshua are many. So many. It's a long discussion just to talk about that. I'm only going to bring up a couple. You know, he's the favorite of the Father. He becomes Lord over them all, but only after he first suffers. And he suffers at the hands of his brothers. But I want to point out one of the parallels that you never really hear. And that is that Joseph has a special robe which is taken from him. Yeshua also has a special robe which at the end is taken from him. John 19:23 and on says, "When the soldiers had finished crucifying Yeshua, they took his clothing and divided it into 4 shares, one for each soldier. But there was one garment, seamless, woven in one piece from neck to hem. So they said to one another, instead of tearing it, let's throw dice and decide who is to have it. In this way the words of Scripture were fulfilled. They divide my garment among them and cast lots for my garment." And that is what the soldiers did. Now, before this, just before this, he had been scourged. And we're told he had been scourged, and then they led him away, and the soldiers mocked him and made fun of him. And it finishes by saying, "And when they had finished making fun of him, they took off the cloak and dressed him in his own clothes and led him away to be crucified." Those are the clothes he shows up in at the cross that they take again from him to divide, and there's that special robe. And I'm going through all this to point out that that robe, surely, after his scourging, would have been covered in blood. This is an important parallel. So now, back to our Parsha time, about Joseph. Now, Israel loved Joseph more than all his children because he was the son of his old age, and he made him a coat of many colors. Now, my father has become very interested in weaving. He's got all these looms now. He just loves spinning his own wool, dyeing everything. And whenever I get with him, he wants to show me, how weaving works, which is fascinating, I have to say. And there's so many tricky things you can do with all the fancy looms they have now, and everything. You can make any pattern you can imagine, and it's kind of cool. But 3,500 years ago, things were simpler. And if you wanted to make a garment with many colors in it, at its essence, you would have one color and you'd weave with it for a little while, then you would change colors and weave for a little while, change colors and weave. And what pattern would you end up with if you do that? Stripes. And where does one wear a garment? Don't we have a saying, he'd give you the shirt off his back? Joseph's father, who loved him the most, put stripes on his back, just like Yeshua's father did. And that coat made him recognizable. And so his father sends him out to his brothers, just like Yeshua's father did. And he sends him out to his brothers, and his brothers see him coming, and they start planning to get rid of him. It says to kill him, but really the most important thing is get rid of him. They just don't want him around anymore. It says, so when Joseph reached his brothers, they pulled off his robe, the special robe which he was wearing, and catching hold of him, threw him into an empty well. Now, Reuben does step in here, because they're going to kill him. And so he is trying to do the right thing by being the oldest, by being the firstborn, the protector of everyone. And he at least stops them from killing him, so they throw him into the well. And his plan is to come back around later when they're not looking and get him and rescue him. Well, I don't know what happens to Reuben in this story. He goes off, because by the time he comes back to get Joseph, he's already gone. Well, now, Judah takes charge. And it's Judah who says, What do we gain by killing our brother and covering up his blood? Now, sure, they want to get rid of him, and that would get rid of him. But then they would have to deal with that somehow, and all they would get is rid of him. So he starts thinking, he sees these caravan in the distance, and he starts thinking, well, we could get rid of him and get money. So let's sell him. So we'll do two things. We will get rid of him, and we'll get money. That's way better. And after all, seeming to lean towards the righteous side, and then at least we won't have blood on our hands. 2. So it's like a bonus. Okay. So what do they tell Jacob when they get back? What do they tell him? Wild animals killed him? So they feel like they're free, right? It was an accident, nothing could be done. Jacob is convinced that his son has been torn apart by a wild beast, and so they all go on with their lives. And Joseph is sold off, and he goes to the house of Potiphar in Egypt. And what is the very next thing the story tells us? What's the next thing in the story? Come on, we read it, right? Okay. This is why I'm always harping on you that it's one story. And also why it's really important for you to always have read it so that when I throw these little things out, you get the connection. That's called preparing your soil. Okay? Now, it would seem like the very next thing, we're already told he's sold off to Potiphar, so we're going to follow him to Potiphar's house and hear that whole story, how he gets thrown into prison, tricked by the wife. But that is not the next thing. The next thing is this weird tale about Judah and Tamar. Out of the blue. What is that? But God is telling this story. So we have to take special care to observe what's going on in this weird insertion, because it can't be weird if God put it there. All right. Now, so the next thing we're told is Judah has 3 sons. The first one is very wicked, but Judah marries him to a woman named Tamar. But before they're able to have any children, the son who is so wicked, God kills him. So Judah says to his second son, you go into Tamar and provide for her children for your brother. That's the right thing to do. He's responsible as the patriarch to make sure that his daughter-in-law has a child. So he sends the brother in, who's also evil, and doesn't allow her to get pregnant by him. And this displeases God. God kills him too. Well, Judah's got one son left. And he's thinking, I don't think I want him to get mixed up with this woman. But to forestall her, he says, well, when he grows up, because he's pretty young, when he grows up, I'll let you marry him. Okay. So she just stays in her widow's clothes for then. But after he grows up, Judah doesn't give him to her. But it's Judah's responsibility to make sure she has a child. And she knows that. So she goes off, knowing where he's going on some travels, pretends to be a prostitute, covers her face so she's not recognizable, entices him, he goes into her, and for a promise of payment, he leaves behind some items with her, of his. And before he has a chance to send her the payment, she, not really being a prostitute, back at home, hiding his stuff, just waits. And of course, the inevitable occurs. Eventually, it's obvious that she's pregnant, but not obvious how that could be. So the worst is thought, and it is told to Judah. And his response is, well, she's to be killed. And so he sends to have her killed. Well, she sends him his items, and when he sees them, he makes this odd statement. She is more righteous than I am, since I wouldn't give her my son, Shelah. Now, this little story all by itself does make some sense. He had the responsibility. She basically forces him to own up to the responsibility. Not best case scenario for sure. But he pretty much lets her off the hook. But I think there's something a lot more going on here because of where the story is put and how the story is put. Now, when Judah sees these items, I don't think his mind was on the situation with Tamar at all. This is what I think is going through his mind. Judah had robbed his father Jacob of his child. And how did he get that point across of what had happened to Joseph? It says, they took Joseph's coat, and slaughtering a goat, dipped the coat in the blood. And then we want to think they all went back with it and said, look, Dad, Joseph was killed by wild animals. That is not how the story is told. They didn't even go back. They sent the coat with a message. We found this. Do you recognize this? And Jacob comes to his own conclusions about what happened. Judah robbed his father of his son, his brother. And he sends the item and says, do you recognize this? Tamar, who he was robbing of a child, sends his items to him, and she says with the message, do you recognize this? When he sees those things, I don't think he's thinking about Tamar and his responsibility to her. I think he's thinking about Jacob and his responsibility to him. And that is why he sees that she is more righteous than him. Not because he didn't give her a child, but because he stole one from his dad. I think this is the turning point for Judah. I think this is the point where he makes his real teshuvah, his real repentance. And why do I think that? Okay. As a side note, the child produced with Tamar becomes the ancestor of David, which leads us to Yeshua, whose robe is taken from him and in blood. So back to our parsha. The time comes, the second time, for the brothers to go back to Egypt and buy grain. But they cannot show up without Benjamin. But Jacob can't stand the thought of them going with Benjamin, because he only had 2 sons from Rachel, Joseph and Benjamin. He's already lost Joseph in his mind. He can't stand the thought of his favorite wife's only other son being lost too. Now, Reuben once again does try to show up as the firstborn, and he says, well, you're worried about losing 2 sons. If anything happens to Benjamin, you can kill my 2 sons. What a guy. So after a fashion, he's doing kind of his job. But Judah now, whose job it isn't, steps up. Judah steps up and he says, no, I will be the guarantee for Benjamin's life. If anything happens to him, it's my life for his. That's why I think we see a turn in Judah after these things. So they do go back to Egypt with Benjamin, and Joseph traps them with this plot of hiding the cup in Benjamin's bag. And when they're first approached about the issue, they swear whoever has the cup will be lost. Well, then it's Benjamin, the worst one. So then they all go back. But it's interesting. It first says they answered, they, unspecific, answered, whoever has the cup will be lost. But when it's time to go back, it specifically says Judah and his brothers go back. And when Joseph says to them, no, you can all go free, only the guilty one will stay behind, only Benjamin, that's where we get our parsha, Vayigash. Judah steps up and he says, my Lord, please allow your servant to speak a word with you. Please do not get angry with your servant, for you are just like Pharaoh. And then he goes on and he recounts the entire story of how they first came down and how they had to go back without, and how they, their father's going to just die if he can't see his son Benjamin again, and the whole thing. And then he ends and he says, indeed, I myself pledge security for the boy with my father, saying, if I do not bring him back to you, then I will bear the blame before you all my life. And so then he continues to Joseph, please now, let me remain as my Lord's slave instead of the boy. As for the boy, let him go back with his brothers. For how can I go back to my father if the boy is not with me? And I think this last thing he says is what finally gets through the point that Joseph needed to hear. He says, I could not bear to see my father's pain. And at that point, Joseph can't control himself anymore. And that is the point at which he reveals himself to his brothers. He's been there the whole time, but it's then when he can see that they're where they need to be, and it's Judah, that he reveals himself to them. I think this is a picture of what's going on right now. Yeshua came. Now he's not with his people in the way he really wishes he could be. Judah, the people are called Jews after Judah. You know that, right? I think it's down to this. When the people finally make that turn that he's waiting for, and they say, Baruch haba b'shem Adonai, blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. That's when he's been with them the whole time. He's with all of us all the time. That is the moment that he will not be able to control himself anymore, and he will show himself once again. Now, I think Scripture tells us that every human alive has the capacity to recognize God. And I believe that us as believers have that piece of God in us. And he is sending us with that item out into the world to anyone we meet with the message, do you recognize this?